This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Welcome back to Season 5 of the Animal Highlights, where we're focused on animals and politics. All the content from this season has been extracted from Season 6 of the Animal Turn podcast, which is a season of the same name, Animals and Politics. This season, my co-host will be Virginia Thomas, who's an environmental social scientist. She was previously also a research fellow with the Wellcome Trust-funded project From Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals. In this animal highlight, Virginia Thomas discusses honeybees and the ways in which they're exploited for their honey. She notes how much labor goes into making honey and the scale of the industry that relies on it. All right, hi Virginia, welcome back to the Animal Highlight. So, who are we going to be focusing on today?
Well, in this animal highlight, I'm highlighting the honeybee. Because insects like bees are usually literally and figuratively beneath our gaze. We often don't notice or appreciate the things they do, including the things they do for us. Bees do a great deal for humans, and I think they're one of the few insects that we do perhaps notice and appreciate, at least to some extent. But of course, as Gary has just been explaining, from an abolitionist standpoint, we shouldn't be exploiting what bees or other animals do at all. And honeybees are remarkable animals, particularly because of their social organisation. I should say that more than 20,000 species of bees have been identified, and there's a huge amount of diversity among the species. Not all of them are social. Some of them, like the mining bee and the cuckoo bee, are solitary. But the honeybee is social and lives in colonies that can have tens of thousands of bees living together. And for social insects like the honeybee, the colony is a superorganism whose survival is important rather than the survival of individual bees. And to achieve this, honeybees cooperate and collaborate in highly evolved and complex ways, particularly through the division of labour, which is determined through their caste system of female queens, male drones, and female workers. The main role of queens and drones is to reproduce to ensure the survival of their own colony in the case of the queen, and other colonies in the case of the drones. The workers do all the work of maintaining the colony, cleaning, ventilating and guarding the nest, feeding and caring for larvae, building wax comb cells, looking after the queen, foraging for and storing food, and even feeding the drones. And as you can imagine, communication is incredibly important to animals who live with so many others, and bees are famous for the way they communicate. They've developed a sophisticated system of dancing to share information about the location and quality of food with other members of the colony, which includes information based on calculations made in relation to the position of the sun.
That's really cool. I think I've seen some of the videos of this dancing, and it looks a bit like a wiggle and a jive. Is that right?
Yeah, it gets called the waggle dance sometimes, but actually, I was reading for this. It depends where the food is. If the food's in one place, they do the waggle dance, and if the food's in another place, they do the circle dance. But I can't remember which way around it is. You have to be a bee to understand this kind of stuff.
I love the idea that, I guess dancing is a form of communication, any which way you put it. But yeah, the idea of bees dancing, you watch those videos and it's quite remarkable to just kind of see how they move, and they know exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I suppose you could say dancing's even a form of human communication, but it's much more crude than the sophisticated dance of the bee. Honeybees do two things that are particularly interesting to humans. And they pollinate plants and they make honey. Both of these things are natural honeybee behaviours, and wild honeybees pollinate plants and make honey independently of humans. But over thousands of years, people have learnt to manage honeybee behaviour to exploit it more effectively for their own purposes. This started with an interest in keeping bees for their honey and also their wax. And a paper by Guy Bloch and colleagues suggests that there's evidence of beekeeping as early as the 10th century before the Common Era. Today, though, honeybees are perhaps even more important to people for their pollination of crops. Bees and other pollinators pollinate wild and domestic plants, and 35% of our crops depend on bees and other pollinators, making bees essential to crop production and human food security.
Wow. Yeah, I've read a bunch of stuff with regards to that. I know that honeybees are often kind of flagged as these key pollinators, but also wasps, flies, a whole bunch of insects that we don't think of with regards to pollination. But yeah, it's incredible that our whole food system is reliant on these insects and their mobility and like the overlapping of how we eat and they eat.
Yeah, and you're right. I think bees are quite famous for it, but we do forget the other insect pollinators quite often. But there is a huge overlap between what you just said, what they eat and what we eat, because in financial terms, it's estimated that bees contribute 22 billion euro a year to Europe's agricultural industry and $14 billion a year in the US. But although this is very important to people, it's a very utilitarian teleological way of thinking about bees. And this is something which the abolitionist standpoint, which Gary was just describing, would argue against. And Gary was also talking about veganism in relation to abolitionist views. And he described veganism as the avoidance of eating, wearing, or using any animal product, which of course includes honey and wax. And often when people who aren't vegans think about dietary veganism, they remember meat, dairy products, and eggs, but they might forget about honey. People knew some of the incredible figures associated with honey production. They might take bees and their exploitation by people more seriously. So over her entire life, which is admittedly short, only a few weeks, a worker bee will make only 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. And it takes 2 million visits to flowers to make 500 grams of honey, which is roughly the size of jars of honey that are sold in supermarkets. So in terms of exploitation, think of the sheer scale of lives and work and effort that has gone into that small jar of honey, which we take for granted.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. Honey is something that trips people up quite readily when they're approached with veganism. I get asked it quite often, but you don't eat honey? Like it's a plant. And it really does confuse folks, but it's because it's such an exploitative kind of product. And part of the reason being is it's not just that it requires a whole bunch of labor and effort for bees to produce the honey, right? Like they expend enormous amounts of energy to create this, and their reserves to kind of sustain them over winter months and also for their young to eat. But it's because in industrial bee operations, what they also do is they replace this really rich, nutrient-rich honey with like a sugary syrup, right? So the bees are getting fed, but they're getting fed with something that's much more deficient in terms of nutrition. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are, and it's not kind of proven unequivocally, but there's been a lot of like what's the word I'm looking for? It's hive collapse. A lot of hive collapses are happening where just entire hives die or they disappear. And this is becoming a huge concern because, like you said, we rely quite heavily on bees. And it's not just us who rely on bees, right? A lot of ecosystems are reliant on pollinators. And colony collapse is really, really significant and important. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this for ages. And it's not just that they're feed deficient. You see, I don't know if you watched when preparing for this, some of the videos of how the bee colonies are moved around in order to facilitate this pollination process. So you'll go to kind of places where there's massive monocrops, like where they farm almonds in California, for example, and you'll see trucks and truckloads of beehives. So industrial beehives being driven around, and they get parked, they open up so that the bees will go and pollinate, and then they bring them back in. And oftentimes, queen bees are killed. Anyway, there's many reasons why it's not why vegans don't eat honey, and clearly I'm just going on a bit of a spewing thing here, but thank you for flagging that, because it is something I think that's part of generally an ethical vegan standpoint, so I appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you so much to Virginia Thomas for being an incredible co-host, and to Rebecca Shen for her work on the logo and all the artwork done with the animal highlight. The show was edited and produced by myself. This is The Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.